Thank you for joining us tonight. We are discovering the old children's fairy tales that have inspired key elements for Disney princess classics. Please see the links to the original text in the comments below. We will begin with a few stories from Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm. First, The Princess and the Frog. The Frog Princess is a series of children's novels published by E.D. Baker in 2002. The Disney film The Princess and the Frog is loosely based on those children's novels and not the original Brother Grimm's tale. However, there are still common threads to The Frog Prince, or Iron Henry, written by the brothers Grimm as the first story in their collection in 1812, Kinder und Hausmärchen. One evening, a young princess with a bonnet and clogs is playing with her golden ball and drops it down a spring. She says that she is willing to give all her fine jewels and clothes and pearls if someone will retrieve her ball. Then, a frog appears and offers to get her ball in return for the princess, taking her home so that he can love her forever. She agrees, but has no desire to keep her promise. After the frog retrieves her ball, she runs as fast as she can, leaving the frog behind. That night, she hears a knock at the door, and it is the frog. She is so nervous, she shuts the door and runs back to the dinner table. Her father asks who it is and then forces her to keep her promise to the frog once she explains the story. So, she brings in the frog to eat at the table with her and then sleep in her bed. But the frog leaves in the morning, and the princess believes she has gotten rid of the ugly thing. The next night he returns to enter her home, eat from her plate, and then sleep in her bed. This repeats for the third night as well. There are a few variations of how the frog's spell is broken. In one story, the princess threw the frog against the wall, another when the princess kissed the frog, and a final when the frog simply needed to sleep on the princess's pillow. When the prince comes to life, the prince promises to love and marry her and take her away to his kingdom, and she agrees. They rode off in a coach with 8 beautiful horses and lived happily a great many years. The Frog Prince also has a servant Henry, who is bound by 3 bands around his heart to keep it from breaking when his master was cursed. When the curse is lifted, Henry's heart is freed. Another Brothers Grimm story found in that same children's book is Little Snow White. In this story, a woman pricks her finger while sewing, and 3 drops of blood fall on the snow. She thought to herself that she wanted a child as white as snow, red as blood, and as black as the windowsill she was sitting near, made of ebony. Soon after, the queen did have a daughter with skin white as snow, lips red as blood, and hair black as ebony, so they called her Snow White. Unfortunately, as soon as she was born, the queen died. A year later, the king took a new wife, and she was beautiful, proud, and arrogant. She had a magic mirror. She would say, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who in this land is fairest of all?" To this the mirror answered, "You, my queen, are fairest of all." Then she was satisfied, for she knew that the mirror spoke the truth. This happened daily until Snow White turned 7, and she became more beautiful as the light of day. And the queen said, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who in this land is fairest of all?" And it answered, "You, my queen, are fair, it is true, but Snow White is 1,000 times fairer than you." Envy and pride grew like weeds in the queen's heart, and she built up a hatred every time she saw Snow White. So the stepmother hired a huntsman to take Snow White into the woods and kill her. And as the huntsman followed her orders, but as he began to plunge the knife into her, Snow White began crying and begged him to release her into the woods, that she would never return again. He agreed. Instead, he killed a wild boar and cut out its lungs and liver as proof of Snow White's death. The stepmother boiled the lungs and liver to eat for dinner after the hunter returned and believed in the death that had come. Snow White ran as fast as she could into the woods until she came to a small home. The house was small, tidy, and had a white tablecloth with 7 little plates, 7 spoons, 7 knives, 7 forks, 7 mugs, and there were 7 little beds set against the wall. Snow White was so hungry, she ate a few vegetables, a little bit of bread, and some wine. She then fell asleep on the 7th bed. Now there were 7 dwarfs, who dug for ore in the mountains. When they returned, they were startled by Snow White, but she was so beautiful they did not wake her. The next morning, the dwarfs asked her name and how she found their small cabin. So she told them about her stepmother and the huntsman. The dwarfs offered for her to live with them if she kept their home neat and orderly. The dwarfs warned that she should not let anyone in their home for fear that her stepmother would find her. That night, the queen looked in the mirror with her normal response, but the mirror said, "You, my queen, are fair, it is true, but Snow White beyond the mountains with the 7 dwarfs is still 1,000 times fairer than you." The stepmother knew that she must deceive the princess. So she dressed to deceive and kill Snow White 3 times, each time checking the mirror to realize the results of her scheme. First, she dressed as a peddler woman to sell Snow White new lace for the corset of her dress. The stepmother pulled the lace quickly so that Snow White couldn't breathe. When the dwarfs returned, they let out the corset and she began again breathing. Next, the stepmother enticed Snow White to open the door with a beautiful hair comb. When she brushed Snow White's hair, Snow White was poisoned and fell to the floor. The dwarfs washed her hair and she came back to life. Finally, the stepmother went deep into a private room of the castle and concocted a poison apple. She dressed as a peasant woman and knocked on the door of the cottage. At first, Snow White refused to let her in, but the apple was so artfully made that Snow White could not refuse. When Snow White barely had a bite in her mouth, she fell down dead. The queen checked her mirror that night and confirmed that she was the fairest of all. When the dwarfs found her dead, they checked for poison, but could not find any. They went to bury her in the ground, but she still looked so lifelike. They built a transparent coffin and set her on the side of the mountain. The dwarfs took turns guarding her and never leaving her alone. They mourned her with the animals from the forest for 3 days. Then, one day a prince came, and seeing the golden coffin, he knew he must take her and honor Snow White as his most cherished one. The dwarfs agreed, and his servants carried her through the forest. When one servant stumbled, it dislodged the apple from Snow White's teeth, and she woke up unsure of where she was. The prince was joyful and promised to marry her and take care of her at his father's castle. Snow White agreed, and a wedding celebration was planned. Snow White's stepmother was also invited. Before the stepmother left that night, she looked into the mirror and realized that Snow White was not dead. She was frightened, and when she saw Snow White at the celebration, she could not move. For the stepmother's transgressions, they put a pair of iron shoes in the burning coals, and the stepmother was forced to step into the red-hot shoes and dance until she died. The story of Rapunzel begins with a man and a wife who longed for a child. There was an enchantress who lived in a tower close to them and had a huge garden, but they were very afraid of her. One day the wife saw rampion flowers growing in the garden and longed to eat them, or she might die. That night her husband went over to the garden wall and stole some rampion for his wife to make a salad. The next day his wife longed for the rampion 3 times as much as the day before. But when the man went back that night, the enchantress caught him stealing from her garden. After taking mercy on him, he agreed to give her his first child for as much rampion as he wanted. When the couple did have their baby, the enchantress came immediately, named the child Rapunzel, and took her away. When Rapunzel was 12, the enchantress locked her in a tower in the middle of the forest with no stairs or door, but just a little window at the top. When the enchantress wanted to climb up the tower, she would say, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair." Rapunzel's hair was like beautiful spun gold that the enchantress would climb up. A couple years later, the king's son was riding through the forest and heard the most beautiful singing from Rapunzel. Every day he returned to hear her singing. One day he saw the enchantress come and yell, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair." So the next evening he went to the tower and yelled the same thing. He climbed up her hair. At first she was frightened, but then he proposed marriage and told her how mesmerized by her singing he was. Rapunzel knew that the king's son loved her more than the enchantress. They agreed Rapunzel would weave a ladder out of silk that he brought her until they could escape together. They continued to see each other until Rapunzel accidentally revealed that the enchantress was much heavier than the king's son when she climbed up her hair. This infuriated the enchantress, who cut off her hair. The enchantress then sent her to a desert to live in grief and misery. When the king's son came that next evening, the enchantress tricked him and let down Rapunzel's hair. The king's son escaped by leaping out of the window, but pierced his eyes on the thorns beneath. He wandered blind, weeping over his lost wife. Eventually, the son wandered through the desert and heard the beautiful singing. He found Rapunzel with a son and a daughter of her own. She wetted her eyes with her tears. She wetted his eyes with her tears of joy, and his eyes were healed. He led her back to his kingdom, where they lived long, happy, and content. There are over 345 different versions of the Cinderella story globally. Many times it is unsure if they were written within the culture or written later, but have similar characters and storylines that are set within those cultures. We will look at 3 of the Cinderella stories. First, Cenerentola by Giambattista Basile is featured in the Pentamerone, or the Story of Stories, published in 1850. The story begins, in the sea of malice, envy frequently gets out of her depth, and while she is expecting to see another drowned, she is either drowned herself or is dashed against a rock, or happened to some envious girls about whom I will tell you a story. Zezola lived with her father, a widower prince, and he loved her very much. He provided her a governess who took care of her and was very kind to her and waited on her hand and foot. The governess told Zezola she would treasure her forever if she could convince the prince to marry the governess. The prince and the governess were married. While many were dancing at the wedding, a dove flew down and perched on a wall near Zezola, stating that she sent her request to the dove of the fairies in the island of Sardinia, and her wish would be immediately granted. The governess spoiled Zezola for 6 days, but then slowly brought her 6 hidden stepdaughters to their home. Zezola's father fell in love with the daughters, forgetting about Zezola and leaving her to sleep by the hearth. On one occasion, the prince had business in Sardinia and asked the daughters what they would like to bring back. Zezola asked for her father to commend her into the dove of the fairies and have them give her anything. Her father forgets, but has a rocky journey home and must go back and visit the grotto of the fairies. Eventually, her father returns with a seed, golden trowel, and golden bucket. Zezola waters and takes care and a date. Zezola waters and takes care of the tree until a date tree forms and a fairy comes out to grant her wishes. When her sisters leave for a ball, Zezola wishes for a beautiful gown. She then arrives to the ball as well as an unknown beauty who amazes the king. Zezola goes to the 3 feasts with the beautiful gowns from the fairy, but slipped away from the king all 3 nights until one of his men gets a hold of her slipper on the final night. The king ordered all of the women for another feast to try on the shoe, and she is eventually found to be the woman the king sought. The daughters return home to their mother, dismissing the king, saying that he is a madman who resists the stars. Second is Cinderella by the brothers Grimm, published in 1857 and translated into English by Margaret Hunt in 1884. This story begins with Cinder's mother dying in bed and telling her daughter to be good and pious, and then the good God will always protect you, and I will look down on you from heaven and near you. Soon after the death, her father takes another wife who has 2 daughters. The sisters grow to hate Cinderella and use her as a housemaid. When her father is gone on a trip, she asks him to return with a stick that she plants into a tree by her mother's grave. When her father returns, her sisters and mother go to a ball without inviting Cinder. While Cinder is by her mother's grave, 2 birds appear to help her get dressed for the ball. Cinder attends the ball, dances with the prince, and is the most beautiful woman there. The prince walks with Cinder home, but she escapes through the chicken coop. When the prince uses an axe to break through the coop, she is not there but has escaped out the back. The next night, there's another ball. The prince walks her home, and she climbs up and out of a pear tree to escape the prince again. On the final night of the ball, the prince has the staircase smothered in pitch, and her shoe is left behind. He knows where she must live, so he goes to the 2 sisters to see who will fit in the shoe. The first sister cuts off part of her heel to cram her foot in the shoe, but Cinder's birds tell the prince she is lying with blood pouring from her foot, and the prince returns home back to their home for the other sister. The next sister cuts off her toes, and the birds return as they're leaving to tell the prince she is also a liar with blood pooling in the shoe. Finally, the prince asks about any other women living in the home. Cinder tries on the shoe, and it fits immediately, and a wedding is planned. On the way to the ceremony, the 2 white doves land on Cinder's shoulders. Her sisters also stand on either side of Cinder, and the birds gouge their eyes out. On the way out of the church, the sisters switch sides, and the birds gouge their other eyes out as well. The ending line of the story is, "And thus, for their wickedness and falsehood, they were punished with blindness all their days." The final Cinderella story is The Little Glass Slipper, or Cindrellon, by Charles Perrault in his Tales of Mother Goose, first collected in 1696. In 1901, it was translated into English by Charles Welsh. This story is the closest version to the Disney movie, but it ends with the sisters living with Cinderella in the palace, and there are 2 morals to this story. The first moral: beauty in a woman is a rare treasure that will always be admired. Graciousness, however, is priceless and of even greater value. This is what Cinderella's godmother gave to her when she taught her to behave like a queen. Young women, in the winning of a heart, graciousness is more important than a beautiful hairdo. It is a true gift of the fairies. Without it, nothing is possible. With it, one can do anything. The second moral: without doubt, it is a great advantage to have intelligence, courage, good breeding, and common sense. These and similar talents come only from heaven, and it is good to have them. However, even these may fail to bring you success without the blessing of a godfather or godmother. We will also look at 3 stories that form the basis for the Dark Sleeping Beauty story. First, Sun, Moon, and Talia by Giambattista Basile from the Pentamerone in 1893. There was a father who had a daughter whom he loved deeply, and he sends for astrologers to predict her future. They say that she will be brought down with a splintered flax, so he bans all flax material from his home. One day, a woman is walking by the window with a spindle, and Talia is intrigued by the thing she has never seen. She tries the spindle and gets a splinter under her fingernail and falls unconscious. Her father is in such disarray that he leaves her daughter in the sitting room and moves away from the country mansion. One day, a king is walking by the home, and his falcon flies inside and doesn't return. So the king goes inside, but doesn't find anyone alive. He sees Talia, carries her to the bedroom, and impregnates her with twins. The king returns to his castle. 9 months later, the babies are delivered, Sun and Moon. One of them sucks on her finger and relieves the splinter, bringing Talia back to life. The king returns and explains what has happened to Talia, but the king must go back to his kingdom and his wife. His wife begins to suspect that the king is in love with another woman, so the queen sends a secretary to follow the king on the hunting trip, ordering that he will be killed and his body never found if he does not comply in taking notes on the king, or that he will be rewarded handsomely for doing as she says. The secretary returns, revealing Talia, Sun, and Moon. The queen becomes enraged and develops a plan to bring the 3 of them to the palace. She then instructs the cook to kill the children and serve them to the king in his dinner. But the king has compassion and takes the children home, serving the king lamb instead. Talia meets the queen, who is preparing a spit over a fire to roast her to death. Talia begins to undress herself, yelling in pain with each garment. The king hears her screams, and the queen reveals that he has eaten his own children. But the king saves Talia from the spit. It is also revealed that the queen cannot have children. The king goes to kill the cook, who assures the king he has not cooked his children. The cook's wife brings the kids, and the king marries Talia. Moral: those whom fortune favors find good luck even in their sleep. Our second story is The Tale of Briar Rose by the Brothers Grimm in Kinder- und Hausmärchen, published in 1812. A king and queen had no children, but wanted one. One day when the queen was bathing, a crab crawled out of her tub and told her she would have a daughter, and she did. The king and queen were so happy they threw a celebration. They only had 12 golden plates, and there were 13 fairies, so they were forced to not invite one fairy. Now the fairies brought gifts including virtue and beauty. The fairy that was left out came into the celebration angrily and said that because she was not invited, the daughter would prick herself with a spindle and fall over dead. But the 12th fairy had not given her a present yet, and the 12th fairy's gift was that the girl would not die but fall into a deep sleep for 100 years. The king ordered all of the spindles in the kingdom be destroyed. One day when the princess was 15, she was wandering around the castle while her parents were away and came to an old tower. She climbed up the narrow staircase and unlocked a small door with a small yellow key. The door sprang open. She was attracted to an old woman who was spinning. As the princess went to try the spindle, she pricked her finger and fell asleep. At that moment, everyone in the castle fell asleep, and a huge hedge grew around the castle. Now many men heard about the beautiful Briar Rose, and so they tried to cut through the hedge. But many were stuck in the thorns and died miserably. Then, one day, a prince was traveling throughout the land, and when he heard the story of Briar Rose, he decided he must go and save her. When he arrived at the hedge, it turned flat to flowers, and only allowed him in, but not the men with whom he was riding. In the castle, everyone was still asleep. When he arrived in the tower, the prince was so amazed with the princess's beauty, he bent down and kissed her. At that moment, the whole castle awoke, including the king and queen. The two were married and lived long and happily until death. Our third story is The Sleeping Beauty in the Woods by Charles Perrault. A king and queen finally and joyously have a daughter. They found 7 fairy godmothers for her, and at her christening they all arrived with gifts. The gifts included being the most beautiful person in the world, having the wit of an angel, the wonderful grace in everything she did, being a perfect dancer, the ability to sing like a nightingale, and playing all kinds of music. But there was one evil old fairy who brought her a terrible gift, that the princess should have her hand pierced with a spindle and die of the wound. Another fairy assured the king and queen that the princess would not die, but would fall into a 100-year sleep. So the king forbade anyone to spin with a distaff or spindle. But one day, while her parents were away, the princess went exploring and came upon a very old woman who had not heard the proclamation and was spinning. The princess tried the spindle and pricked herself immediately and fell unconscious, and no one could wake her. The fairy, upon hearing this, returned immediately to the king and queen. In order to not fear the princess, when she arose, the fairy put to sleep all of the servants and maids in the castle tower, and then grew up a thick forest around her for protection. The king made a decree that no one should go near the tower. 100 years later, a prince was running through the forest and wondered what was in the tower. He spoke to some peasants around the tower, and one of them told him about the princess living there. As he rode through the thick forest, the trees allowed him through, but not his company. As he entered the tower, everything looked as if time had stood still. He ventured up to the tower and looking upon the beautiful princess, falls to his knees. She is awakened and asked, "Is it you, my prince?" They spoke for several hours and then returned downstairs for a feast and to be married. Now the prince returned to his kingdom and did not tell his parents that he was married, but simply hunting. His mother did not believe him, but he did not tell his mother because she was part ogre, and he knew that she would try to eat his children, and she wanted to eat all the children she came near. The prince returned to live with the princess for 2 years, and they had 2 children. When his father died, the prince returned with his wife and children to the palace. Now one summer he had to make war and leave his wife and children at the castle. So the mother devised a plan to send off the princess and eat the children. However, this failed because the cook saved the children in his home. The queen believed she ate both of the children and sent to eat the princess as well. The cook saved her, but one day the queen heard the children and princess playing, and so ordered a pit of serpents to be brought into the square. Before she is able to throw all 3 of them in the pit, the prince arrives to save his family. The ogress was so enraged that she threw herself into the pit, and the prince was consoled by his family. Moral of the story: many a girl has waited long for a husband brave or strong, but I'm sure I never met any sort of woman yet who could wait 100 years free from fretting, free from fears. Now our story seems to show that a century or so later, early matters not, true love comes by fairy lot. Some old folks will even say it grows better every day. Yet this good advice, I fear, helps us neither there nor here. Though philosophers may prate, how much wiser 'tis to wait. Maids will be sighing still. Young blood must when young blood will. Finally, Beauty and the Beast. The original author of Beauty and the Beast is considered to be Gabriel Suzanne Barbeau de Villeneuve. It was first published in 1740 and 362 pages long. Later, Jean-Marie Le Prince de Beaumont abridged the story, and the abridged story is what we will look at tonight. There was a man with 3 sons and 3 daughters, the youngest daughter being the most beautiful, so they named her Beauty, and her sisters were very jealous. She also loved to read instead of going to parties. The 2 oldest brothers had great fortunes, and many suitors came to make offers for Beauty, but they refused the courtship, for her brothers would not agree unless he was a duke or earl at least. Beauty said that she was much too young to be married. Unfortunately, the merchant father lost his whole fortune and was forced to move out to a small country home a great distance from town. The 2 oldest brothers wanted to stay in town because of their many lovers, but the sisters were left by their lovers and forced to move to the country. No one took pity on the 2 oldest sisters because of their pride and cruelty towards Beauty. Beauty could still marry whoever she wanted, but she chose to go with her father to the country instead. At the farm, the fathers began to farm and husband animals. Beauty woke up at 4 a.m. every day and became very strong. Her sisters did not rise until 10 a.m. and mocked her for her contentment with the farm chores. One day the father embarked on a business trip, hoping to return with some of his former wealth, but it was a failure and left him more poor than when he embarked. Before departing, his oldest daughters requested jewelry and fine clothes, while Beauty simply asked for a rose. Upon returning, the father got lost in the woods and thrown from his horse. It was freezing, and he began to hear wolves. The father saw a light in the distance with a stable. He entered the home and dried by the fire after tying up the horse. The father waited for the master of the house until 11 p.m. but found no one. So he ate some chicken from the table, drank some wine, and went to bed. When he awoke the next morning, his spoiled clothes were clean, and outside the snow turned into beautiful gardens. As the father went to leave the property, he noticed rose bushes and remembered the promise he made his daughter. As he began to cut some roses, a horrible beast came out of the woods and threatened to kill him for stealing his roses, his greatest possessions, even after the great hospitality the beast showed. The father explained that he was simply trying to bring a gift home to his daughter. The beast promised to let the man go if he sent one of his daughters to die in his place. If not, he must return in 3 months. However, the beast gave the father a trunk that he could fill with anything from the castle, and the beast sent it home with him. Sent it to his house. When the father returned to the home, he was sobbing deeply, gave Beauty the rose, and told the whole story. Upon criticism from her sisters, Beauty relays that she will return to the beast and sacrifice herself. The brothers refused to let her go, saying they will find the beast and kill him, but Beauty would not allow that. The father and Beauty left for the palace, where the beast fed them and clothed them overnight, but then bid the father farewell. Beauty thought for sure she would be eaten by him that night. After her father departed, she explored the palace and found a great room full of bookshelves and a harpsichord and several music books. The room was titled Beauty's apartment, and she realized the beast intended for her to stay there for a great time. She also found a note stating that she should speak her wishes, and so she wished to see that her father was well. On the looking-glass, she saw her father dejected and returning home to Beauty's siblings. The beast invites Beauty to dinner, and Beauty accepts out of fear. Beauty conceded that she enjoyed Beast just the way he was, kind and wholesome, though ugly on the outside. Upon the end of the meal, Beast asks her to marry him, but she refused. The beast grew angry and left. Every night at the same time they dined together, and every night Beauty became more fond of Beast, but only as a friend. Eventually, Beauty told Beast that she would never desire to marry him, but remain friends forever. The Beast asked her to never leave him, but she could not promise that, because she had seen in the mirror that her father missed her dearly. Her sisters were married, and her brothers all joined the army, and he was alone. The Beast made a deal that she may leave to see her father for 1 week before returning to the castle. He also said that he would die of grief if she did not return. The beast gave her a ring that if she sat on her bed table, she would return to the palace. The next morning she found herself at her father's home. Her father, overjoyed, called her sisters, and they brought their husbands. However, her sisters were very unhappy and jealous of the beautiful garments Beast gave Beauty. The two sisters schemed to keep Beauty there longer than 7 days so that the beast would grow angry and punish her. After staying at her father's home 10 days, Beauty became ashamed for the harm she had caused Beast. She reflected on how kind and tender-hearted Beast was, and how silly it was that she would not marry him. So she took off her ring and set it on her nightstand. The next morning she returned to the palace, and when she put on her beautiful garments for dinner, Beast had not arrived on time. She ran through the palace to find him lying on the ground, nearly dead from starvation. She told him that he must not die because she desired for him to be her husband. At that moment the palace sparkled with lights, fireworks, music, and the Beast was no more, but a handsome prince stood in front of her. For the prince was under a spell that could only be lifted by a virtuous woman falling in love and consenting to marry the prince willingly without knowing his true identity. In the next room was the fairy, Beauty's father, and all of Beauty's family. The fairy cast a spell on Beauty's two oldest sisters that they must live forever as statues outside of Beauty's palace, staring at her happiness. Beauty and the Beast lived for many years in happiness, as it was founded on virtue. Thank you for joining us tonight. We look forward to seeing you at the Harris-Elmore and Genoa Libraries.